An old man stands alone at the mouth of a cave. The stone is cool under his hand. Behind him, the mourners have gone home. The hired weepers have folded their black cloth and walked back down the hill toward Hebron. The last of the funeral bread has been eaten. And now it is just him, 137 years old, and standing at the entrance to a burial cave he bought 3 days ago from a man named Ephron the Hittite, 400 shekels of silver, weighed out in front of witnesses at the city gate. Think about that for a moment. This man was promised an entire country. God told him the land would belong to his children like the stars belong to the sky. And the only piece of it he will ever actually own, the first deed, with his name on it, is a hole in the ground to bury his wife. Her name was Sarah. She was 127 years old when she died. They had been together for more than 60 years. She had laughed at God and been corrected by God. She had held a son she was told she was far too old to ever carry. And now she was gone, sealed behind that stone, and Abraham had wept for her. The text says it plainly. He came to mourn, and he came to weep. So here is what you already believe about this story, even if you have never said it out loud. You believe it is over. The promise landed. Isaac was born. Sarah is buried. The old man has done what he came to do, and all that is left is for him to grow quiet, grow gray, and be laid in that same cave beside the woman he loved. That is where every Sunday school lesson stops. That is where the sermons end. But the Bible does not stop there. Turn the page, literally the very next chapter, and something happens that almost nobody preaches, almost nobody notices, and almost nobody can explain. The opening line of Genesis chapter 25 reads like a door creaking open in a house you thought was empty. Then again Abraham took a wife. Again, at 137 years old, a grieving widower takes another wife. And she is not a footnote. She bears him 6 sons. 6. And those 6 sons become the fathers of nations, whose names still sit on the map of the Middle East today. Nations of caravan traders and desert priests, one of which will shape the single most important escape in the entire Old Testament. Her name was Keturah. And here is the strange part, the part one want you to hold onto for the next half hour. Scripture cannot seem to decide who she is. One book calls her his wife. Another book calls her his concubine. And an ancient tradition, older than most of the church, whispers that she was not a stranger at all, that Abraham had met this woman before, loved her before, and sent her away before. We will come back to who she really was. But not yet, because this is not a story about an old man's twilight. This is not a story about a genealogical footnote. This is not a story about 6 forgotten names in a list. This is a story about what God can still do with a life the world has already finished mourning. Let us go back to the grief, because you cannot understand what comes next until you sit in it the way Abraham had to. Sarah did not just die. She died first. In more than 60 years of marriage, through famine and exile, through Egypt and Gerar, through the long ache of childlessness and the impossible joy of a baby at 90, they had faced everything together. And now, for the first time, Abraham was facing something alone. There was no one left who remembered the beginning. No one who had stood beside him back in Ur, back when God first said the word go, and a younger man packed up his whole life to follow a voice into a country he had never seen. Sarah had been there for all of it, and Sarah was gone. You know this grief if you have ever buried someone who knew you before you became who you are. It is a specific kind of loneliness. It is not just missing a person. It is missing the only witness to your whole life. And notice where he buries her. Not in a family plot back home. He has no home anymore. Not on land he inherited. He inherited nothing here. He has to buy a grave from strangers. The children of hate watch as this wandering old chieftain bows before them and asks, almost apologizes, for a place to lay his dead. I am a stranger and a sojourner among you, he tells them. A stranger, after all these years, after all these promises. Still a stranger. He pays full price. He will not take it as a gift. And that cave at Machpelah, near the oaks of Mamre, becomes the first square foot of the promised land that actually belongs to Abraham, bought not to live on, but to grieve in. Here is what most people miss. When you read the account straight through, Sarah's death lands at a very particular moment. Abraham is 137. Isaac, their miracle son, is 37 and still unmarried. The whole future of the promise is riding on this one young man, and this one young man is alone, and now his mother, the woman who fought heaven to bring him into the world, is dead. The text even tells us later that Isaac was not comforted after his mother's death until he loved a wife. He was grieving too. So the very next thing Abraham does is find Isaac a bride, a girl named Rebekah, brought back across the desert to a grieving household. Isaac sees her coming in the evening light. Scripture says he brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he loved her, and he was comforted. Sit with that picture for one more second, because it is beautiful, and it is also lonely. The son is comforted. The son has a wife now, a tent, a future, someone to love. And the father? The father is standing outside that reunion. His work is done. His son is settled. The promise has a next generation. By every reasonable measure, Abraham's story is complete. He can rest. He can wait for the cave. That is the moment, that exact moment of a finished life and an empty tent, when the Bible drops the sentence that nobody expects. Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. Stop and feel how strange that is. He is nearly 140 years old. His great love is buried. His heir is married. There is no more promise to fulfill, no more covenant riding on him, no more heaven-sized reason for him to do anything at all. And he chooses to love again. He chooses to build again. He chooses, at the far edge of a long life, to say yes to a new beginning, when everyone would have understood if he had simply sat down and waited to die. And her name is a small poem all by itself. In Hebrew, Keturah comes from the same root as the word for incense. Keturah, the fragrant smoke that rises off the altar, the offering that curls upward toward God. Her name means something like the perfumed one, or more literally, incense. Sweet smoke rising up. Think about what that name is doing in this chapter. Just a few pages earlier, we watched smoke of a very different kind, the smoke of Sodom and Gomorrah, going up like the smoke of a furnace, the smoke of judgment. And now, at the end of Abraham's life, comes a woman whose very name is the good smoke, the rising fragrance, the offering that pleases. It is as if the story is telling you, before you know a single thing about her, that something sweet is about to rise out of the ashes of Abraham's grief. But here is the tension you cannot ignore, and I promised we would hold it. That same Bible, just a few verses later, and again in the book of 1 Chronicles, does not call Keturah a wife at all. It calls her a concubine. The sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine. Two labels for one woman, sitting in the same story, and the text never explains the gap. Was she elevated to full wife, and then remembered as a concubine? Was she always a lesser bride, whom one author generously called a wife? Or is there another answer, an older, stranger answer, hiding in a name and a rumor from the deserts to the south? We are going to get to that. I promise you we are. But first you need to meet her 6 sons, because until you know what these boys became, you will never understand why heaven bothered to write their mother into the book at all. Before we meet those sons, do something for me. If you have ever been told your best chapters are behind you, if you have ever stood at the edge of an ending and wondered whether God was finished with you, then this next part is going to hit differently. So hit the subscribe button now, before you forget, because this channel exists for exactly this, the parts of the Bible nobody reads to you on Sunday. And drop one word in the comments right now, the name of someone in Scripture you think got overlooked. I read them. Now the 6 sons. Genesis lists them in a single breath, the way you would rattle off a phone number. She bare him Zimran, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua. 6 names. Blink and you miss them. Most people read that verse the way you read the ingredients on the back of a cereal box, eyes sliding right over it. But every one of those names is a doorway, and behind each door is a people, a territory, a piece of the ancient world. So let us slow down and open them, because this is where the chapter stops being about one old man's second marriage and starts becoming about the map of an entire region. Start with the firstborn, Zimran. The name carries the sound of a word for music, song, celebration, and the oldest traditions place his descendants along the western coast of Arabia, on the trade lanes running down toward the Red Sea. Picture it, a firstborn named for music, and a people planted, where the caravan roads and the sea winds meet. Already, in the very first name on the list, the story has walked out of a tent in Hebron and onto the map of a continent. Then Medan and Midian. The names sound almost like twins, and their peoples would spread across the northwest of Arabia and down into the deserts east of the Jordan. Hold on to Midian especially. Circle his name in your mind. Because 400 years after this old man dies, the entire future of Israel is going to run straight through the land that bears this fourth son's name. But it gets stranger, and we are not there yet. Then Ishbak and Shua, who push north and east, their names resurfacing centuries later along the Syrian and Arabian frontier. And here's a thread worth pulling. Open the book of Job, one of the oldest books in the entire Bible, and you meet one of Job's 3 friends, a man called Bildad the Shuhite. Shuhite, from Shua. More than a few readers across the centuries have wondered whether that title reaches all the way back to this very son of Keturah, which would mean a grandchild of Abraham's forgotten marriage, sitting in the dust beside the most famous sufferer in Scripture, arguing with him about the ways of God. You start pulling one loose thread in this family, and the whole ancient world comes up with it. But pay attention to this, because the second son is the one that changes the scale of everything. Jokshan, on his own, another name in the list. But Genesis does something with Jokshan it does not do. With the others, it keeps going. Jokshan, the text says, became the father of Sheba and Dedan. And those 2 names would have made an ancient listener sit straight up. Because Sheba and Dedan were not obscure. They were the great caravan peoples of Arabia, the traders of gold, of precious stones, and above all, of incense. The very substance Keturah was named for. The frankincense and myrrh that moved north out of the Arabian deserts on the backs of camels, along routes so valuable that empires fought over them, would flow through the hands of Keturah's grandchildren. Do you feel the poetry tightening? A woman whose name means incense becomes the grandmother of the incense traders. The perfume in her name becomes the perfume on their camels. Scripture rarely raises its voice to point these things out. It just lays them side by side and trusts you to notice. And we are not guessing at all of this from the Bible alone. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing for a Roman audience in the 1st century, took the trouble to name Keturah's sons and tell his readers what became of them. He calls them men of courage and of sharp minds, and he says they went out and settled the lands of Arabia and the region reaching toward the Red Sea, the country the ancients called Arabia Felix, fortunate Arabia, the wealthy, fragrant south. A Roman-era historian, with no reason to flatter a Hebrew patriarch, confirms it. These 6 boys, from a grieving old man's second marriage, became real nations on real land, remembered by name centuries later. So why does the Bible seem almost embarrassed about them? Here is that tension I keep circling back to. Look at what happens right after the list of sons. Genesis says Abraham gave everything he had to Isaac. Everything. And to the sons of the concubines. There is that word again. He gave gifts, and then, while he was still living, he sent them away, from Isaac his son, eastward, to the east country. He sent them away. Sit with how that lands. These are his children, his blood. 6 sons he fathered in his old age, presumably held as babies, watched take their first steps across the same desert Isaac had crossed. And the arrangement is that they receive a parting gift and a direction, east, and they go. The inheritance, the covenant, the land, the line of promise, all of that stays with Isaac. The sons of Keturah get provisions and a horizon. Now, you can read that as cold. Plenty of people have. But look closer, and something more careful is happening. Abraham is not abandoning them. He is providing for them and protecting the promise at the same time. He gives them gifts. He sends them out equipped, not empty. And he sends them, while he is still alive, which means he does it deliberately, in the open, so there can be no war over the will, after he is gone, no repeat of the bitterness that had already torn his household once before. Which brings us to the word the Bible uses for Keturah in that very sentence. In Hebrew it is pilgesh. We translate it concubine, and to modern ears, that word sounds like a mistress, something shameful and hidden. But that is not what it meant. A pilgesh was a legally recognized secondary wife, bound by covenant, living in the household, her children acknowledged and named and provided for. Not a scandal, a status, a rung on a ladder in a world of complicated ancient households. So which was Keturah, the wife of Genesis chapter 25, verse 1, or the concubine of verse 6 and of 1 Chronicles? And why does an old tradition insist that the answer to that question is a woman we have already met, a woman with her own long history of being sent away eastward, into a desert, with nothing but a provision and a promise? Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, 400 years are going to pass. A man is going to run for his life into the fourth son's country, and everything Keturah's name has been quietly promising is going to catch fire, literally. 400 years pass. The old man in Hebron is long dead, buried, in the end, right where he wanted to be. Genesis tells us he died at 175, an old man, and full of years, and that his sons Isaac and Ishmael, the two who had every reason never to stand in the same place, came together to lay their father in the cave at Machpelah beside Sarah. 38 years he lived after her death. 38 years, 6 sons, and a whole second family. All of it, after the moment you and I assumed his story was over. But now he is gone. Keturah is gone. The 6 sons have scattered east, into the deserts, into the caravan routes, into the pages of history. And one of those sons, remember the one I told you to circle, has become a nation, Midian. The descendants of Midian are now a people of the desert, shepherds, traders, tent dwellers moving across the harsh country southeast of the land of promise. They have their own towns, their own priests, their own gods, and, as we are about to see, at least one household that still remembered the God of Abraham. They are, by blood, the great-great and so on grandchildren of a grieving widower and a woman named Incense. And they have no idea that their quiet corner of the wilderness is about to become the most important refuge in the Old Testament. Because far to the west, in Egypt, a man is running for his life. You know his name. Everyone knows his name. He was born a Hebrew slave, drawn out of a river, raised in Pharaoh's palace as a prince of Egypt. And then, in one reckless afternoon, he killed an Egyptian who was beating one of his own people, buried the body in the sand, and discovered by morning that everyone already knew. Pharaoh wants him dead. The prince has become a fugitive. And so Moses, the deliverer of Israel, the man who will one day part a sea and carry down a mountain the law that half the world still lives by, runs. He runs east, out of Egypt, across the wilderness, as far from his old life as his legs can carry him. And where do his legs carry him? Into the land of Midian, into the country of Keturah's 4th son. He collapses, exhausted, beside a well. And if that image sounds familiar, it should, because wells are where this family's great turning points always seem to happen. There he defends the 7 daughters of a Midianite priest from a gang of rough shepherds, and the priest, a man named Jethro, takes this Egyptian stranger into his home. Moses marries one of those daughters. Her name is Zipporah, and for 40 years, the future liberator of Israel lives as a shepherd in the desert of Midian, in the household of a priest of Midian, raising sons with a daughter of Midian. Do you see what has happened? The bloodline of Abraham, that everyone dismissed, the sons who got gifts and a goodbye, the branch that was sent east and written out of the inheritance, that branch becomes the shelter that keeps Moses alive. The family scripture seemed almost embarrassed to mention is the family that hides and feeds and marries the man God is about to use to save everyone. Keturah's grandchildren, many times removed, become the in-laws of Moses. And here is the part that should stop you cold. It is out there, in Midian, Keturah's country, while Moses is keeping Jethro's sheep on the far side of the wilderness, that he comes to a mountain and sees a bush that burns and is not consumed. It is on Keturah's soil that a voice says, "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." It is in the land seeded by that old man's second marriage that the whole Exodus begins. The perfumed smoke of her name, the incense that rises up, and now, in her descendants' land, the fire that does not go out, the offering that ascends, and the flame that will not die. Scripture never says these two things are connected. It just lets them stand next to each other, 400 years apart, and waits to see if you are paying attention. Now, I told you we would come back to who Keturah really was. It is time. For as long as there have been rabbis reading this text, some of them have refused to believe Keturah was a stranger. And they point to that troubling word, pilgesh, concubine, and they ask a simple question. Which woman in Abraham's life had already been his secondary wife? Which woman had already borne him a son in his old age? Which woman had already been sent away, eastward, into a desert, with a provision and a promise ringing in her ears? There is only one answer: Hagar. And so in ancient tradition, you will find it in the great collection of rabbinic commentary called Genesis Rabbah, and the medieval sage Rashi records it too, teaches that Keturah is Hagar. That after Sarah died, Abraham sent for the woman he had once been forced to cast out. That the mother of Ishmael came home. That the tent Sarah left empty was filled again by the very woman Sarah had once driven into the wilderness. And that she took a new name, Keturah, incense, because her deeds had become as sweet and fragrant as the offering that rises to God, or, some say, because she had kept herself faithful through all the long years of being sent away. I want to be honest with you, the way this text deserves. Not everyone accepts that tradition. Many careful readers hold that Keturah was simply another woman, a genuine second wife, and that the text means exactly what it says. Both readings have stood for centuries. The Bible itself does not settle it, but sit for one moment inside the possibility because of what it would mean. It would mean that this quiet epilogue is not a footnote at all. It would mean it is a reconciliation, a homecoming, a God who does not waste the people we exile, who does not forget the ones we send away, who gathers up the cast out and the grieving in the same final chapter and makes, out of both of them, 6 nations and a name that smells like worship. And whether or not Hagar and Keturah are the same woman, here is what is undeniably true, and here is where I need you to think about your own life for a second. Somewhere, right now, someone is standing where Abraham stood, at the mouth of a cave, at the edge of a fresh grave, at the end of the only chapter they thought they had left. Maybe it is a widow who cannot imagine a morning that does not start with an empty side of the bed. Maybe it is a man who buried the only person who knew him before he became who he is. Maybe it is you, and the loss is not even a death. It is a marriage, a career, a version of your life that got lowered into the ground and sealed behind a stone. And the whole world, kindly, gently, has agreed that your story is basically over, that all that is left now is to grow quiet and wait. That is exactly the moment, the finished life, empty tent, nothing left to do moment, when the God of Abraham writes the sentence nobody expects. Then again, 2 words. Then again. This is not a God who only works in the first chapter. This is not a God who runs out of pages when we run out of hope. This is not a God who closes the book at the funeral. This is a God who, at 137 years old, in the ashes of the deepest grief a human heart can hold, leans down and begins again. So what do you carry out of this? Let me leave you with 3 things. The first is simple, and it is a fact you can hand to anyone who thinks they know Abraham's story. It does not end at Sarah's grave. It ends 38 years later, after a second marriage, 6 more sons, and the founding of nations, whose names, Midian, Sheba, Dedan, still echo across the ancient world. The man you thought was finished at 137 had almost 4 decades, and a whole family still ahead of him. The tomb was not the last chapter. It was barely the halfway mark of his heart. The second is closer to home, and it costs a little more to receive. The promises of God are bigger than the chapter of your life you are convinced is the final one. You will bury things, people, dreams, whole seasons. You will stand at the mouth of more than one cave. And the temptation, every single time, will be to believe that the ceiling of that stone is the ceiling of your story. It is not. As long as there is breath in you, there are two words God has not stopped being willing to write over a human life. Then again, and the third, this is the one I most want you to take with you. The woman at the center of this whole chapter is someone almost no one can name. She gets 4 verses. She is called a wife in one breath and a concubine in the next. She may have been an exile brought home, or a stranger who became a bride, and the Bible never even bothers to tell us her face, her age, or her final words. By every measure the world uses to decide who matters, Keturah does not matter. She is the definition of overlooked. And she is the mother of half the map. Her sons became 6 nations. Her bloodline ran into the land where Moses met the burning bush. Her name, incense, rose off the pages of the oldest stories like fragrant smoke off an altar, sweet before God long, after everyone else had forgotten she was there. That is the promise buried in this forgotten chapter. There are no forgotten people in the hands of God. The one the world overlooks, heaven names. The one sent away eastward, heaven gathers home. The smoke you thought had blown away is rising. All this time, straight up toward the only one whose remembering actually counts. So let me ask you before you go. Be honest with me in the comments. Before this video, had you ever once heard the name Keturah? Had anyone ever told you Abraham married again? Tell me below. I read every single one. And the next time you stand at the mouth of some cave in your own life, certain the story is over. I hope you hear those 2 quiet, stubborn, world-remaking words rising up out of the 25th chapter of Genesis. Then again,